Men are so necessarily mad that not to be mad would amount to another form of madness, said Blaise Pascal, a French mathematician, physicist, writer, and Christian philosopher. It takes a certain madness to embrace the ebbs and flows of life and to truly experience its mysteries and beauty. Madness has been explored for decades, and French philosopher Michel Foucault examined the evolution of madness in Europe. According to Foucault, the gesture that divides madness is the constitutive one, not the science that grows up in the calm that returns after the division has been made. Foucault explains that the man of reason no longer communicates with the madman. The man of reason has the power to denote what is sane and insane, while the madman is pressured to act and essentially be something other than himself in order to communicate with others. Confinement has been used throughout history, dating back to leper colonies, which were vast houses of confinement where people with leprosy were sent, which gave rise to the ritual of exclusion. Foucault says, quote, "Madman that was banished in the 17th century, expelled by a society whose norms he could not be seen to conform, is now a candidate for prisons, asylums, and punishments. In reality, this character is merely the result of superimposed grids of exclusion." In this explainer video, we'll be focusing on a particular case in Victorian Britain. But before that, let us delve into how asylums were during that period. The Victorian asylums had a poor reputation. It was a place of misery where inmates were locked up and left to the mercy of their keeper. William Hogarth, an English painter and social critic, drew the following painting as a part of his 8-painting series called The Rake's Progress. This painting, titled The Madhouse, was the last of the series that shows Tom Rakewell being shackled in a chaotic ward at Bethlehem Hospital, one of the oldest asylums. This painting by Wilhelm von Kaulbach depicted the mentally ill patients in the courtyard of an asylum, while the warden lurks in the background. We felt this described the asylums in Victorian Britain very well, since the normal-looking warden on the right with the keys is staring at the mad-looking inmates with disgust, signifying that the mentally ill are just confined together away from society with no means of recovery, just like Foucault described. Having seen these paintings and having explored the history of madness and the asylums in Victorian Britain, we'll be moving on to discuss Joseph Baines' case.
So what transpired in the case of Joseph Baines? Well, on June 6, 1854, Joseph Baines, a 38-year-old, was seen by a neighbor entering the house of his father-in-law's second wife, whom he regarded as a mother. The neighbor was unalarmed by this, as his mother was likely expecting her son. However, shortly thereafter, the woman, Sarah Hickling, was seen rushing out of her house yelling "murder" several times while appearing to be fleeing. Baines then appeared with a look in his eyes described as wild, and swung a fireplace poker at his mother's head multiple times. He then grasped the weapon by two hands and continued to beat her until he was sure she was dead. By this point, several frightened neighbors had arrived, but kept a distance for their own safety. Baines threw the weapon down and was seen escaping to the town center, but not before he returned again to continue beating Hickling one final time. In the midst of all this, someone had gone to fetch the local police, who caught up with Baines at a local pub where he was found in a delirious state. Baines was said to be crying, sobbing, and stamping the floor before he abruptly composed himself and suggested that all would be well if he simply went for a light jog. On July 25th of that same year, Baines was tried at the Lincoln Assize. The courtroom was informed that Baines had suffered a trauma of sort in the months leading up to the incident. What was this trauma, you ask? It turns out that Baines was a skilled tailor and had inexplicably ignored an order for a suit. This was described as the beginning of his decline in terms of his trade and health. He was no longer a dutiful husband and peace-loving father, and was instead a monster who was morose and depressed. Additionally, hereditary madness was cited in his case, as both his sisters and mother were described as troubled. The asylum physician was convinced that, presented with such a strong set of factors, Baines was most likely insane at the time of murder. Medical witnesses present at the trial also believed that he suffered from moral insanity. Later that year, Baines was declared not guilty on the grounds of his insanity and arrived in Bethlehem Hospital, then known as the State Criminal Lunatic Asylum, on October 11, 1854. There was considerable outcry in response to and criticism of the ruling of the case, with many in the press portraying the asylum as a comfortable sidestep to the death penalty, something he would have likely faced had it not been for the insanity plea. Even Her Majesty's pleasure couldn't silence a storm of critics, with Fraser's magazine referring to an imbecile jury. In the mind of the public, turning down work was no reason to kill. 8 years later, on September 18, 1862, Baines was declared fully recovered and no longer a threat to society. He was therefore released and allowed to return home a free man. His return, however, was met with fierce anger and resentment, especially from those who witnessed his heinous acts firsthand. Accordingly, Baines was dubbed the Lincolnshire Killer.
Now that we have discussed what transpired in the case of Joseph Baines' insanity plea, we will now go over the insights we had from Vaughan's commentary of the case, and also apply relevant insights from Perlin's and Foucault's readings. One of the most noticeable features of the incident was the direct involvement of the public and how that changed the general perception of the case. As mentioned earlier, the gruesome incident took place right in front of the neighbors, and the general consensus among the neighborhood was that employing the insanity plea for the case of Joseph Baines was, quote, a miscarriage of justice, and that the trial was, quote, preparing to save the man from the rope. This public disagreement with the verdict was highlighted when Joseph returned after 8 years, and his welcome back to the neighborhood was met with a placard nailed to the door saying Lincolnshire Killer. This element of public perception was in fact the theme of Perlin's 2017 piece on the 9 myths regarding the insanity defense. The Baines incident took place as early as the 1850s, and to this day, a common myth among the people that Perlin describes is the idea that criminal defense attorneys use the insanity defense as a means of, quote, beating the rap. And even though Perlin offers empirical evidence from case law suggesting the contrary, it is no surprise that such a myth became so widely accepted. After all, incidents like Joseph Baines' case, where the public had a first-hand experience with such a brutal crime, probably made it challenging for the public to view the verdict objectively and caused them to apply their emotionally charged sense of justice, prioritizing the punishment of Baines over his recovery. The public perception of the, quote, not guilty on the ground of insanity verdict and the aforementioned myth that still holds true more than a century later both emphasize how much more power emotions such as fear and hatred have over empirical data informing lasting opinions and beliefs. Now, of course, to claim that the public disagreement had absolutely no basis in reason would be unfair, as there were several questionable arguments in the trial. A word that was thrown around a lot during the trial was hereditary insanity, a popular defense that suggested that there is a higher chance of mental illness if it is seen in relatives and family members. Although a popular defense even close to 2 centuries later now, evidence suggests that a correlation is, quote, far from conclusive, and this assumption leads to, quote, biased research, according to Dr. Schoenfeld's scholarly article on hereditary madness. Now, we would be remiss if we did not discuss this very vague term that they gave for Baines' condition, moral insanity. The objective of many such similar trials is to prove if the defendant can, quote, distinguish between right and wrong. However, proving something so abstract has always been challenging and resulted in questionable verdicts, and this case is no different. As a matter of fact, a year after the trial, Fraser's magazine raised a very important question. Was not every crime the result of moral decay? And if that is the case, what fundamentally differentiates criminals suffering from mental illness and criminals who aren't? This brings us to the very question of madness and its origin. We discussed Foucault's very revolutionary work, History of Madness, and these questions really make us wonder whether madness was not the cause of the murder, but was instead the result of the confinement of a criminal who had, quote, asocial attributes. And if the state criminal lunatic asylum was more a place of punishment than recovery, it brings to question what Foucault pointed out throughout his work. Are these correctional facilities more effective in punishing and isolating people than reforming them? The public viewed the asylum as a, quote, comfortable sidestep to sentence of death. However, in Baines' case, not only did he probably suffer a lot in those 8 years in the asylum, but the neighborhood's resentment over their belief that he had it easy probably made it even harder for him. This ultimately begs the fundamental question, how can we allow former criminals to have a fresh start back in society? Would such antagonism not be a self-fulfilling prophecy and further cause the former criminal to resort to previous behavior?
Another big idea that was brought up in Vaughan's commentary was the idea of precedent. The idea that maybe such a gruesome murder had to be punished to set the right precedent because the law is as strong as the precedent it sets. Fraser's magazine termed the verdict a, quote, brutal recklessness, and that to acquit criminals of this class on the ground of irresponsibility is only to induce others to follow in the same course. It was quite interesting to see the idea of precedent applied to a concept as fluid and case-specific as mental illness. This makes us question whether the legal system, of which the effectiveness depends on its consistency, is truly fit to deal with mental illness, which can vary from case to case despite very similar circumstances. Today, our understanding of mental health is definitely more informed than in the 1850s, and perhaps we can look back at our past to understand how the legal system approached this fluid issue before and use those experiences to improve our management of cases involving mental health. After all, with the much larger context of what we know now, we can better see where we went wrong and at least build off the precedents set for illnesses that are known, while leaving room for discussion for illnesses that are yet to be classified.